So I think we can get started. Welcome to today's webinar again. Before we get started, a few logistical points again. The webinar will be recorded and both the slides and the recording will be shared afterwards with you. You also have a Q&A section available in the webinar. You can use it to already ask questions during the presentation. I will have an eye on your questions, and if they fit into the flow of the webinar, I will ask them immediately. Otherwise, we also have a Q&A section at the very end. The topic of today's webinar is a deep dive on the CS3D approach to risk assessment and appropriate measures. In the webinar about a month ago, we focused on comparing the German Supply Chain Act, the LKSG, versus the CS3D, and we're highlighting some differences in approach. And today, the focus is really all on the CS3D, and we want to highlight, based on some examples and case studies, what the CS3D approach to risk assessment is, and also what the approach to prioritizing appropriate measures is. With me today, I'm delighted and excited to again have Sebastian Rünz, salary partner at Taylor Wessing. And with that, I will actually hand it over to you, Sebastian. Feel free to introduce yourself and also kick us off with the timeline. Just a reminder for everybody on the timeline to get started.
Thanks a lot, Harald. I hope that most of the participants already know us by now. I don't know how many webinars we already had together, but it's quite a lot. So I maybe just start and we just dive right into the topic. So for those of you who already joined our last webinar, this is a repetition, but we just want to give you again a short overview on what is happening on the EU level and also in Germany. So as you can see on this timeline, we have a parallel development in Germany and in the EU. So the LKSG, the German Supply Chain Act, entered into force this year for companies with 3,000 or more employees, and then its scope will extend in the next year, and it will apply to companies with 1,000 or more employees. On the EU level, we have by now 3 different drafts of EU institutions, which are the draft of the CS3D of the EU Commission, then another draft of the EU Council, and the latest draft, which is also our webinar focus today, of the EU Parliament. And right now, those 3 institutions are in trilogue negotiations that already started. So far, at least that's what we heard, is that it's not really going on very fast. So there are a lot of organizational points they are discussing in the trilogue negotiations, but still the plan is that they have a final directive ready in the first quarter of next year, before the elections on the EU level, and then with a certain implementation period to transform it into national law, then in 2026, that's the most likely date that the directive will actually apply to companies in the EU. And as you can see, the parallel developments are aligning. So in the end, as soon as we have a European Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the German Act will merge into the European one. And that being said, we don't have 2 different acts that apply to companies in the EU. In the end, we will have all the national laws basically merging into the European law.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a general overview. Now we want to tell you what's our focus today. So in our last webinar, we gave you an overview on the major differences, as Harald said, between the German Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. Today, we would like to focus on two very important aspects, the core basically of all those laws, which is the risk analysis. How does it look like under the German Supply Chain Act and in comparison under the CSDDD, and also the preventive and remedial measures companies falling under those acts need to take. In both due diligence obligations, there are differences between the German law and the EU law, and we will take a closer look what they are exactly.
And maybe if I can add to that, so based on a mutual contact that Sebastian and myself have at the European Union level, we also know that the Article 6 and the 7 and 8 are the ones that are reasonably finished in terms of negotiation. The main points of negotiation revolve around scope and application to the financial sector and sanctions. But in terms of content, Article 6 especially is more or less finalized. So what we're presenting today, we are expecting not to change much anymore based on the current ongoing negotiations.
So let's start with the value chain that needs to be looked at, that needs to be addressed under the German law and the CS3D. So the major difference to mention is the upstream value chain, because there, under the German Supply Chain Act, you only need to look at your direct suppliers beside your own business operations. At your indirect supplier level, you only need to conduct a risk analysis or take preventive or remedial measures if you have substantiated knowledge. This is different under the CS3D. There we don't have, at least, and that's, as I said, the basis for our webinar today. We look at the draft of the EU Parliament. And in this draft, you don't have this distinction between direct and indirect suppliers. So you basically just have the expression business relationships, which could apply to all your partners, all the entities in your value chain, meaning that it may happen that you also need to look at your indirect supplier level if you want to express it with the words of the German Supply Chain Act, meaning your tier N suppliers, your deeper supply chain. You need to look at your deeper supply chain. If you have risks, we will take a closer look right now what this actually means. So when you need to look in your deeper supply chain, because again, that's very often presented in the media in the wrong way, doesn't mean that under the CS3D, you need to look at your entire supply chains and all your supply chains that you could imagine, because indeed that would mean you would maybe look at millions of suppliers. That's not what the CS3D is saying, but we're getting to that. On the downstream level, there are also some differences. I just want to mention them. So under the German Supply Chain Act, you basically do not need to look at your downstream level. Under the EU directive, it might happen that you also need to look at your downstream level, but again, also there, not at the end consumer, the individual consumer. Basically, you need to look at, it may happen that you need to look at downstream level when it comes to transport, storage, waste management. Some of those are also, you could discuss if it actually means downstream, but so there are some slight differences on the downstream level. That's what I wanted to mention, but the major difference between the German Supply Chain Act and the CS3D is in the upstream level at the indirect supplier and tier N level. So here we summarized this, what I just said. So under the German Supply Chain Act, you need to look at your tier 1 suppliers in your own business area in all the times, and at your tier N suppliers only in case of substantiated knowledge, and downstream just partially. CS3D, you need to look at your tier 1 suppliers and your tier N suppliers and your own business area, and downstream only partially. Another topic we addressed in our last webinar, which we don't want to go into details this time, is the risks that are covered. So you have more risks mentioned in the CS3D than in the German Supply Chain Act. So your risk analysis may look at other aspects that you haven't looked at so far under the German Supply Chain Act. But now, and that's really interesting, and now we are getting to our first major focus of today's webinar. How does the risk analysis look like under the German Supply Chain Act and under the CS3D? So on the left side, you can see the German Supply Chain Act, and we call it a supplier-driven approach. What does it mean? It means that basically that's what all the companies, or most of the companies, are doing right now. They are looking at their tier 1 suppliers, and basically at all their tier 1 suppliers. At the tier N level, companies are only looking at if they have substantiated knowledge. And in practice, this means that companies are not looking at most of their tier N suppliers. So if you have, for example, complaints via your complaints procedure, or very detailed information of problems in your supply chain that can be localized into your supply chain, then you would speak of substantiated knowledge. And then also right now, German companies would look at their tier N suppliers. But basically, most of them are just looking at the tier 1 suppliers. So that's why we call it a supplier-driven approach, since companies are looking at basically all their tier 1 suppliers. Now let's compare this to the CS3D. We call that a impact-driven approach. So that's the major difference with respect to the risk analysis. This means that a company, before just looking at all their suppliers, whether at the tier 1 level or at the tier N level, needs to do a impact scoping. It needs to look whether it has adverse impacts. So in German, it's negative Auswirkungen, which are likely or severe. And only in that case, only if you have adverse impacts that are likely or severe, then you would need to go into more detail. Then you would need to do an in-depth assessment. What does this lead to? This leads to the situation that you maybe don't look at all your suppliers. In particular, if you have a huge number of suppliers at the tier 1 level and also at the tier N level, that wouldn't be possible to actually do, to look at all your suppliers. That's why the CS3D has a different approach. In those areas where the company is of the opinion that it doesn't have adverse impacts, they are unlikely and not severe, you would basically not prioritize anything. So those suppliers may happen that you don't look at those suppliers at all, meaning that you're focusing the number of suppliers on the tier 1 level. So this may lead to less work on the tier 1 level, but of course, it depends. If you are a company with very problematic or risky supply chains, then you need to look at more suppliers at the tier N level. Again, also only in those areas where you think of adverse impacts that are likely or severe. If you are a company that doesn't have very problematic tier N supply chains, then it could happen that, again, you're also not looking at very many suppliers at the tier N level. So I already said in the media, sometimes this comes out a little bit different, saying, okay, under the CS3D, you need to look at millions of your suppliers because the tier N is such a bigger number than just the tier 1 suppliers. But on the other hand, the CS3D has a more focused approach. And offers the opportunity to basically do an even more risk-based approach than under the German Act.
Mm-hmm. So Sebastian, this is of course a very radical new concept you're introducing. So maybe we take a look at how can we actually say this? Like on what basis are we saying that this is a different approach?
Good point. Good point. Maybe next time we have to switch the slides, but it's good to show you just maybe with some pictures how this risk analysis looks like. So this is basically mentioned in the CS3D. There you can find the Article 6, which basically says that you need to scope the impacts of your operations, your subsidiaries and business relationships. And then in the second paragraph, it's said you need to identify where adverse impacts are most likely to occur and to be severe. So those two aspects are the ones to look at: how likely are any adverse impacts and how severe are they, and where you come to the conclusion, well, there are no adverse impacts, or they are very unlikely and not severe at all, you wouldn't do any prioritization at all. And this is not only mentioned in the CS3D for the first time. When we look at the next slide, we can see that this was already mentioned in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and also in the UNGPs, where it's explicitly said that companies with a huge number of suppliers don't have to look at all their suppliers, because that's basically not feasible at all. So they are encouraged to identify certain risk areas and only need to look at the suppliers in those risk areas, or at your own business area that is risky, and not at the suppliers or your own parts of the companies that do not constitute a risk at all. Very similar, it is written in the UNGPs. So also there you can find this option of prioritization. And that's basically the wording that shows us, okay, we have a more impact-driven approach. So that's what you need to do first. And now, Harald, you will go into more detail how this basically looks like, this scoping, compared to the German Act that says, at least the Act that says, okay, you just need to look at your supplier level and verify if there are any risks. Maybe just one more thing. Also, the BAFA, the German authorities, in their handouts on risk analysis, they somehow mix this. So also they describe a risk-based approach, saying, okay, you need to before you conduct your risk analysis, you need to look at which countries you're sourcing from, where are the suppliers located. So also, let's say, like a scoping exercise you do before conducting the risk analysis, but it's not really connected. So it's not 100% clear whether under the German Act, this scoping exercise allows you not to look at certain suppliers. In the end, that's at least what the wording of the German law says. You need to look at all your suppliers and see whether there are risks or no risks. And that's basically the difference under the CS3D, where you do not need to do that in any cases.
So if we visualize the risk assessment approach under the CSRD as a funnel, which is, let's say, the risk-based approach, risk-based, also a word that is specifically mentioned in the law. We start working on prioritizing these general areas, not yet on the individual supplier level. And this is what, let's say, Article 6A relates to, this identification of areas where impacts are likely. And the OECD guidelines, they present this word scoping. They call this exercise the scoping exercise. Yeah? And again, this is on a higher level, and we will show you how this works and how this can also be done on the tier N level without looking at each individual tier N suppliers, yeah, because this is where we are at that point. The next step then is the assessment side. So this is Article 6b, carry out in-depth assessment of prioritized operations. So this is where we then look at all of the ones we scoped in detail, and these in-depth assessments are also referred to in the OECD guidelines. Again, they differentiate between first identifying these general areas as part of the scoping, and then doing the assessment, which is a more in-depth process that seeks to identify and evaluate prioritized risks for specific suppliers, specific business relationships. And this is where we are here. And let's say now, let's have a bit of a deep dive into how can this actually be done? So how can this scoping, how can we differentiate between areas we are putting in scope and out of scope? And here we take, let's say, a first clue from the Article 6a, where they are mentioning that this prioritization should take into account relevant risk factors. And risk factors is actually a definition that is specifically mentioned in the CSDDD legal text, where they say risk factors mean company level risk factors, business model risk factors, geographic, so country level risk factors, product and service risk factors, and sectoral risk factors. Now, since we are here doing the scoping not yet on an individual supplier level, we are not really considering the company level risk factors at this point. And if we take, again, guidance from the OECD guidelines, we see that on explaining how the scoping could be done, they say that you could do it based on a country that holds higher risk, on activity or production processes that hold higher risk, or on previously identified risks from previous assessments. So let's say, assuming this is the first assessment, we would maybe not have previous knowledge. So we would focus mainly on these topics of country and activity and production process, which on the CSDDD definition relates to this geographic risk factor, product, service, and sectoral risk factors. And on that level, we would now look at the scoping. And to make it more concrete, let's work with some examples in this scoping. And let's say we try to pick some examples that were also always, let's say, raising some, let's say, eyebrows for the German Supply Chain Act. Do I really need to analyze all of my suppliers? What about the coffee I'm buying for my kitchen, for my employees, for the coffee machine? What about the legal services I'm getting? And let's take some of these examples. So in this case study, we're assuming we are a large multinational manufacturing company, and we buy legal services in Germany from a company called Legal GmbH for an annual spend of 100,000 euros. We are buying coffee for our coffee machines for employees in the kitchen from a Cafe Import GmbH, so a coffee trader or importer, for 25,000 euros per year. And then we are buying call center services. So maybe we have a help desk in India for 1.5 million euros per year. And we are buying batteries. Now, this would then actually be considered real production material for the manufactured goods that we are sourcing out of Vietnam for 50 million euros per year. And let's say, do the scoping exercise for these four examples. And I hand it back to Sebastian.
Okay, still muted. Okay, so this scoping, I already read some of the questions, and some of the participants are asking, okay, but doesn't also the CS3D require that I do a tier N scoping and a tier 1 scoping, and that whether I need to look at all my suppliers to basically to being able to say that there is a risk or that there is no risk. We will get to that. So that's also something that we are addressing. But let's basically at this point just again show you the difference. So under the examples Harald just made, under the German Act, we would basically look at the country level and the sector level. So country risks and commodity risks. On the tier 1 level. So we would, for example, at the legal services, look at Germany, and also at the sector legal services, and maybe we would come to the conclusion, okay, there are no abstract risks, and that's why I do not perform any further concrete risk analysis, and then I'm done in this regard. With respect to the coffee or the other services mentioned, it may be more complicated, because at the tier 1 level, it might happen that we are in a country that doesn't constitute any abstract risks, but maybe we are in a sector that is associated with risks at a tier N level and not at the tier 1 level. So it might be different, the results, when you look at the country and the sectors, but Supply Chain Act basically says, okay, if you have a risk in one of those two, you would need to take a closer look, and that's why in this table we are showing you, we come to the conclusion, okay, in those cases, we would need to perform a concrete risk analysis. Under the CSDDD, it would look a little bit different. Again, of course, we would look at the country, product, service, sector level, but we would not only look at the tier 1, but also the tier N. And the tier N is here just described at tier N. Of course, you could distinguish the tier N in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, meaning that you would need to make transparent your entire supply chain. But according to our view, that is not necessary in all the cases, but we will get to that. So for the moment, we are basically saying, okay, you have the tier 1 and the tier N, and whether you have risks might be different on those levels. So for the first example, you would say, okay, we don't have any tier 1 problems and also no tier N problems, but maybe the coffee example leads to the situation that you have no tier 1 problems because you're buying the coffee from a German company, but still coffee is associated with risks in the deeper supply chain. So the tier N scoping would show you that you have risks in your deeper supply chain. And again, this might happen with the other services, that it's not always problems at the tier 1 level and the tier N level, but maybe just in one of those.
So another way to visualize this scoping in categories, as Sebastian just introduced, let's say, is this square in a square visualization that we have here. And you can imagine putting all of your suppliers in a matrix where you have countries on one axis and categories. Now, this can be your actual sourcing categories, but it can also be sectors, commodities that you have defined. And then rank ordering them by a risk, both on the category and the country level. So you have, let's say, on the top right side, both categories and countries with a significant risk, and then you would be scoping based on that. Now, of course, this is just a schematic approach, and we will, let's say, go a bit more in depth now in the next slides, how this can actually be done. Of course, the challenge is in actually evaluating the likelihood for adverse impacts in these various categories. I think countries reasonably, this is something that has been also solved under the German Supply Chain Act. Sectors as well, but if you want to actually benchmark and score your own sourcing categories, this of course means you need to also develop this data. I will also try to explain how we at Prewave can help there and are working in this direction. But let's say right now, this is just a schematic approach, very important. Maybe the size of this bubble would be the spend or the number of suppliers in such a category country combination. And the guidelines are very clear. At this scoping step, the spend and number of suppliers is not a criteria for scoping in and out of scope. It's just the likelihood or severity of adverse impacts, so a risk-based evaluation at this point. But let's now make it more concrete. If we are now trying to scope the direct suppliers, so the legal services suppliers from Germany, the coffee trader we're buying for the kitchen, and the call center services and batteries, we can think about putting it on a one-dimensional scale, with 100 being, let's say, a low likelihood of risk, and 0 being an extremely high likelihood of risk or adverse impact. We would do that based on a combination of country risk, sector risk, and commodity risks. Commodity meaning the product or service risks that is specifically procured. And we can come to the evaluation that we will scope everything above a certain or below a certain score rather, and would therefore on the tier 1 level have the legal services in Germany out of scope, and also the coffee in Germany out of scope. And this again relates to the coffee trader. So we are buying directly from some coffee trader. They might have 20, 30 employees situated somewhere in Germany. They do not have an elevated risk for human rights abuses themselves, so they are out of scope. Call center in India and batteries in Vietnam, the direct operations would already be in scope, because both of them have maybe around working conditions, the batteries maybe also around some environmental factors based on the material substances used, have some likelihood for adverse impacts, and therefore we're having them in scope. And in scope then means we are proceeding with those 2 suppliers for the next step of the risk assessment. So we would look at the Callers LLC and the Battery Inc. now individually as part of the assessment step in the risk-based approach. This is where we at Prewave then apply a 360-degree scoring based on media screenings, country sector evaluations, also maturity assessments, looking at certifications that these suppliers have. And this gives us then an in-depth assessment of these suppliers, already giving us a shade maybe of red, yellow, green for these suppliers. The benefit again, as opposed to the German Supply Chain Act approach, would be that the legal services suppliers in Germany and maybe also the coffee importer, we are not even adding them to the system potentially. We are just looking individually at the call center suppliers and the battery suppliers in this particular case. And now let's go to the tier N side of things. Again, here we are trying to work on an abstract evaluation. So we are not looking at the individual supply chains of, for instance, our battery supplier in Vietnam. If we have this information, of course, we can use it, but let's work under the assumption that it's, let's say, it takes a lot of resources to produce this information on a deeper supply chain. And for the scoping exercise, it's actually not necessary to have a complete view on the supply chain. Rather, we can make a decision based on, again, the likelihood for adverse impacts in the supply chain. And here we will come to the conclusion that, again, legal services in Germany, they also don't have a likelihood for adverse impacts in their supply chain as a legal services firm. And maybe a similar conclusion could be made for the call center in India. They don't really have, as a services supplier, let's assuming there's no subcontracting going on, they don't really have a supply chain that's at risk. But the coffee trader is exactly the opposite example. The direct business partner I have in Germany as my trader where I'm buying the coffee, they are not at risk, but the supply chain is at risk. So let's say possibly down to the processing or plantation level, there where we would have a likelihood for adverse impacts. So we would be scoping the tier N side on the coffee in scope. And of course, similarly for the batteries. And let's say a way we are doing this, and we have this capability already within Prewave, we actually have also scores for the tier N. And these are abstract scores where we say for a given industry, for a given product, what is the level of tier 1 risk and what is the level of risk in the supply chain of a given material. So let's say the metals and mineral supply chain has a higher likelihood for adverse impacts around human rights than maybe the pharmaceutical industry, again, on an abstract level. So we're putting them in scope. So we have now the tier N on coffee and batteries in scope, but this still leaves us with the question, do we have to map them? So does this now mean for this 25,000 euros of coffee that I'm procuring for my coffee machines, do we really have to map the supply chain all the way to the plantation? And here again, we can look to the guidelines, because again, we actually can find some reference in the OECD guidelines to when should I actually make my supply chain transparent. And here we can see it in point C here, that when appropriate and feasible, you should obtain relevant information about the business relationships beyond the tier 1, beyond the contractual relationships. But the key point here is when appropriate and feasible. And this is now, let's say, leading us into the next and second part of our webinar, where we will look at what is now some criteria for saying what is appropriate. And here we come into these, let's say, definitions and phrases around leverage and nature of contribution. Yeah, I also saw leverage being already mentioned in some of the questions. And this is now what will come up now at the later parts of the risk assessment as we lead into the definition of appropriate actions and also around the question of where should I map.
Maybe maybe I can or we can anticipate at least a part of the results at this point already. So we are of the opinion that it might happen that because you're only directly linked and because you don't have any influence on your tier N supply chain, and that it is not possible to increase your influence at the tier N level, that a tier N mapping, so a making transparent of your deeper supply chain, is not necessary. So that in the end, you would basically leave it with the assumption, okay, we have problems at the tier N level, for example, with respect to coffee, but I don't need to make transparent all the entities, all the companies that are in my coffee supply chain, which could be plenty, and where it's really difficult to get the information because basically you would need to ask your tier 1 supplier, who is your tier 2 supplier, and then you go down the supply chain, and all that for, in the end, something where you don't take any measures because you don't because you're just directly linked and you don't have any influence and you can't increase your influence because basically you are just one of 100,000 end consumers of coffee, that there are grounds to argue that this is not necessary and grounds to argue with the wording of the CS3D and the wording of the OECD guidelines. But now we will take a closer look, as you said, Harald, into the nature of contribution. So what does the CS3D actually say? Which measures are you need to take?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So again, there is a difference between the German Act and the CS3D. Under the German Act, you have certain appropriateness criteria you need to look at all together. So you basically need to look at those criteria, and based on those criteria, you need to come to the conclusion, okay, I take the preventive measure X and not the preventive measure Y, because I looked at the appropriateness criteria and I think it is appropriate to take a certain measure and not another measure. The CS3D has a different approach, and basically not entirely different, but slightly different, because it basically asks the question first, did you cause the adverse impact? Did you contribute to the adverse impact? Or were you only directly linked to the adverse impact? And based on the conclusion of this nature of contribution, you need to take different measures. When you identified risks or identified violations, you would start to ask yourself the questions, did you cause the risk or the violation? If so, you would need to cease, avoid, or mitigate the adverse impact, because basically you're the only contributor, and that is why you need to cease, avoid, or mitigate. And again, this would basically require you to take appropriate measures, and that is where the German Act and the CSDDD are very aligned. So there is a non-exhaustive list of potential measures you could take. If you come to the conclusion, okay, we didn't cause the adverse impact, but we contributed to it, meaning that there is another party that is contributing to it, so several parties, then you would need to avoid or mitigate your own contribution, and to the extent of the other contributor, you need to use your leverage so that the other contributor also avoids or mitigates its own contribution. Then it could happen that you say, well, we didn't even contribute, we're just directly linked. That's the third possibility. Then you would, there wouldn't be any contribution from your side, leading to the situation that you would only need to use your leverage, or if you don't have any leverage, try to increase your leverage on the contributing or causing party or parties. So that's basically the idea of the CSDDD. And let's give you some examples, but really short, because if you're interested, you can read them on your own. It's basically what we were just saying. So causing very often takes place in your own business area, because then it is very likely that you are the only entity that is causing a problem. For example, if you have a pollution that is taking place from your premises, for example, or if discrimination takes place in your own company. Contribution could, it's more likely that this happens at your direct or indirect supplier level, so that basically there is another sphere of influence, the supplier that is causing maybe a problem or contributing to a problem, but you, because you imposed certain strict requirements on the supplier, played your part in the problem, in the adverse impact resulting in the end. And direct linkage would happen, or frequently happens, at a level that is not so close to your own company, which, for example, could be, it's basically just examples, could be a very long, complex supply chain with problems at the origin of the supply chain. There are various companies in between, and maybe you're in the end are an end consumer, and you're not causing or contributing, but you're basically just directly linked. And that, of course, a typical example could be the sourcing of problematic minerals like cobalt. Just to give you some examples. All of this is not, doesn't have to be the case. It could be different. For example, if you are the biggest consumer of cobalt in the world, maybe this doesn't lead to a direct linkage only, but to a contribution, because if you're basically imposing very low prices and very high demands in a very short term to be delivered, then maybe it's more than a direct linkage. But that's, of course, needs to be looked at in the individual case. But now let's just show you some diagrams how this could look like. So basically, you would start to ask yourself the question, as already said, did I cause the adverse impact? if it's not 100% clear, then you would need to do an investigation, and then maybe you come to the conclusion that you can see this on the top in the middle. Okay, am I the only causer or not? If there is another entity causing the effect, then it can only be contribute, then you are at the next level contribution. But if there are no third parties involved and it's your own causation, then it might lead to the fact that you basically are the only causer and you need to cease, avoid, or mitigate. But let's assume that you come to the conclusion, okay, you're not the only causer, but there is another party also contributing to it. Then you would need to look at the next nature of contribution and come to a with an answer to the question, did I contribute to the adverse impact? And again, the wording of the CSDDD offers some ideas how to do that. So those are the green fields in the middle. So contribution could depend on whether you encouraged or motivated an adverse impact by another entity, or whether you could or should have known about an adverse impact or a potential adverse impact, or the degree on which your company already took preventive measures or mitigated a certain risk, or whether you haven't done this so far. So in order to make this more concrete, we thought of some own considerations on the right side, some questions or facts you could go through in order to determine whether you contributed to an adverse impact or not, which, for example, could be, just examples, how was the contract negotiation? Did you impose very strict one-sided clauses on your suppliers? Is your supplier financially dependent? So this could be shown basically by looking at your spend compared to the entire turnover of the supplier. So are you one of the biggest customers or not? Which could be, when you look at the degree of foreseeability, the country or industry risk profile. So did you know about the risks in a certain industry, and or have you had already complaints in your complaints procedure? And connected with that, the questions, the question, have you already evaluated and taken preventive measures, and maybe also looked at their effectiveness and could demonstrate, okay, we a while ago knew about the problems in the supply chain and we took various measures and we know they are effective because we have seen that there are fewer complaints, or this is difficult to track the effectiveness, but at least that you can show to a certain extent, okay, it's not from our sphere, the adverse impact is not resulting from our sphere, but from the sphere of a third party. So again, this is no easy answer to question. In the end, there is no tick the box exercise where you could say, okay, I ask myself 5 questions, and if I come to the conclusion I can answer all 5 of them with no, then I haven't contributed. But when I answer 2 of them with yes and 3 of them with no, then I contributed. So that in the end, that's somehow at the discretion of the company, and it needs to be documented very well. So in the end, you can show to the authorities, okay, we have a system, we thought about this, and we can explain why we come to a certain conclusion. But let's say, again, you didn't contribute to a certain adverse impact, then the only thing left is the direct linkage. And there you would need to, well, ask yourself the question, are you directly linked? And honestly, this is could happen through pretty much everything. Yeah? So a direct linkage basically means, are the adverse impacts somehow connected to your operations, to your services, to your products? So in the end, if you are part of a problematic supply chain and the problems in the supply chain are via certain suppliers connected to you, then it's very likely that in the end you come to the conclusion, okay, you're directly linked. This may look different if there may be a problem, let's say, in a certain region, but still you don't have any, or you can be sure that your suppliers and also your TN suppliers are not connected to a certain problem. So then you would you could come to the conclusion, okay, there is no direct linkage, but to be honest, there is no good definition which helps you to come out of this direct linkage easily. But again, then the result would be of a direct linkage that you just use or increase your leverage, and this could mean and that's what we said basically above, that maybe it doesn't make sense to map your entire supply chain when you come to the conclusion, okay, I'm only directly linked, I don't have any leverage, maybe I already tried to increase my leverage, it didn't work at all, so it's not possible for me as a small end consumer in Germany in a very complex supply chain, that it's not really connected to my core business because I'm basically just buying coffee, that I would need to do anything under the CSDDD. I know this is basically a result that requires some braveness or some courage, because you need to come to this conclusion and say, well, I documented everything, but I can explain why I'm not taking measures in the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so again, let's close the loop on the 4 case studies we had. Let's try to estimate our contribution and our leverage that we have over the 2 tier 1 suppliers we have put in scope, the call center in India and the battery manufacturer in Vietnam. One way to do that, to estimate in particular the leverage, is again the share of revenues approach. So with our spend, how much are we accounting for the overall revenues of that supplier? But of course, it's also the combination of the criteria that Sebastian showed in the flow charts earlier, whether we are considering ourselves to cause, contributor, or just linked to the adverse impact. Let's assume, based on our relationship, we have no reason to say we are causing adverse impacts at the call center services because we are not the sole customer of this call center. And we also have medium leverage because we account for 2.5% of their revenues with our purchase. On the battery side, we would still consider ourselves in the contribution because we are again not a single causer, but we have higher leverage. This is, let's say, strategic production material sourcing. We account for 10% or maybe more of the revenues of this supplier. So here we would consider ourselves to be of high leverage, and we can then also use this leverage. So again, coming out of the assessment side, where we would apply a 360-degree scoring approach, we would then move into the prioritization phase, where we would determine the nature of contribution plus our leverage and would derive the action priority from that. And based on the determinations I showed you earlier, we could say we have higher priority to act and to mitigate risks we are identifying at the battery Inc. than we have at the call center supplier. Now, what are actions we can take? We will get to that in just a second. And maybe to, again, wrap up on the question around the mapping. So here again, we can estimate our nature of contribution to risks in the tier N scope. So let's say for the coffee that we are buying, are we causing issues in the supply chain of the coffee we are buying for our kitchen? Definitely not. Are we contributing? And here we could come to the conclusion that we are such a small factor here in the sourcing. This is just sourcing that we have, let's say, through a trader in a very small volume. We would consider ourselves to be only linked to those risks. We also have no leverage to affect any change in the areas of the supply chain where there are risks present. So in this case, we would come to the conclusion that we are in fact not mapping the coffee supply chain because we are simply directly linked with no leverage. But we would definitely be mapping the battery supply chain where we are in a contribution and we have high leverage and it's strategic production material. So there we would be mapping the supply chain. And mapping then means, and I will get to in just a second, how that could be done. Also, maybe a word, we will have another follow-up webinar where we will again dive more deeper on these very practical questions on how can we map and so on. But let's say for the battery supplier, we are now mapping the supply chain. So we make transparent where the raw materials are coming from, where the processing facilities for some of the raw materials are. And then again, we work them in the funnel, applying the same approach of scoring the risks and then applying measures. Of course, measures for a supply where we don't have a direct contractual relationship is different. But again, we will also get to that now what's possible. Now, with a look on the time, I will not explain in depth how we actually perform the mapping at Prewave. Again, let's leave that for the webinar next month. But I can tell you that we are using public data, so we can map supply chains without actually asking the supplier to a high level of transparency by combining customs data, media data, and predictions around supply relationships that we can then eventually validate with the suppliers themselves. But again, let me refer you to the webinar we have now scheduled on the 30th of November, where we want again to dive even more deeper into, let's say, a concrete implementation guideline on what type of risks you can use and how such a project in terms of mapping, risk assessment can actually work in practice on a software-based approach. And I hand it back to Sebastian to give us now an overview of the types of measures we can take with our suppliers.
Okay, let me do this really short because you are all also getting the slides afterwards. So measures compared between the German supply chain and CS3D are very similar. And here we just listed you the most prominent preventive and remedial measures mentioned in the two acts, and they are very similar. There are some differences. So when you read through them, you get the impression under the CS3D that it's a little bit more focused on your own company, and under the German Supply Chain Act, a little bit more focused on the supplier, meaning the German Supply Chain Act is saying, well, you need to require certain things from your suppliers, and you need to address this, and you need to address that. And the CS3D focuses a little bit more on the on your company itself and on cooperation with other companies. But that's basically just some slight differences in the end. You have those measures potentially to be taken listed in this table, and maybe we can just proceed at this point in time.
Yeah, and last but not least, we mentioned it also in last month's webinar. One of the ways to work with your suppliers is to train them, and you also need to train your own organization under the German Supply Chain Act. And Sebastian and myself, Taylor Wessing and Prewave have actually developed an e-learning that is now available for registration. And we will also send that out afterwards. In case you're interested, let us know. So now we would like to move into Q&A, and we will go, let's say, into overtime. So stay with us in case you're still interested. I think we have a lot of very interesting questions here that we can now dig into. Sebastian, did you find any questions already that?
Yeah, maybe one. So I think it comes up a couple of times. Is the CS3D linked to the CSRD materiality assessment? So yes, the wording is very similar. So the scoping exercise you're doing under the CS3D is basically is performed based on a very similar risk assessment than it's done under the CSRD materiality assessment. There is a difference in the end in some parts, because this the CSRD requires double materiality. Yeah, so you also need to look at the risks for your own company. And this is a little bit different than the CS3D, which basically, and also the German supply chain, which are just focusing on the risks for the potentially affected persons in the supply chain. So in the end, what you're reporting on under the CSRD and the parts of the CS3D are a little bit different. So, but the way to find out, so which are my material areas where I need to take a closer look at, and which are the areas that I need to report on. This exercise under the CSRD and the scoping under the CS3D are very similar. In the end, we will need to wait a little bit more until we have the final version, whether they align the entire wording. So it's basically 100% clear that it is can be done through the same exercise, but at least already right now you can see the similarities.
And another question that was around the EU deforestation regulations. I think this is another case of overlap. You know what I mean? The scope of
right.
is different, but if you are conducting due diligence under the deforestation regulation, it certainly also counts towards your due diligence in the CS3D, right?
And of course, if you're falling under the regulation on the deforestation free supply chain, then it might happen that you need to do certain tier N mappings, yeah, because then it is required that you need to provide very detailed information based on geolocalization. Where is your product coming from? And this would mean that if you're unsure whether you need to conduct a tier N mapping under the CS3D, if you also fall under the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, then it might, of course, happen that under that regulation you need to take further measures.
Mm-hmm. Another topic I see coming up is the question around leverage and using leverage. I think there was one question that said, if I don't have any leverage, which actions should I take? So
yeah. So yeah, maybe so you should take a look at the OECD guidance on responsible business conduct. So that is the OECD guideline addressing this topic. There is a question 37 in that guidance, where it is explained what to do in case you don't have influence and which steps are possible to increase your influence. And there you can see there are some ideas of the OECD how you can increase your leverage, but also at this question it becomes clear that there might be cases where it's also not possible for you to increase your leverage, and that is the thing you need to that you need to write down, and so that you're able to explain why you came to the conclusion, okay, I wasn't even able to increase my leverage.
And of course, leverage can be, and it's actually written also in the, I don't know, is it called preamble of the CS3D, but another factor to prioritize action. So if you come to the conclusion that you are in a contribute nature of contribution with 100 suppliers, then the leverage that you have with each of them could still be used to prioritize between these 100. So you would address the ones where you have the highest leverage first. Of course, as absolutely first step, you would address the ones you're causing. Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe, Harald, there are some questions often very similar. So how do you come to the conclusion that India or Vietnam are problematic? Or how do you come to the conclusion that coffee is problematic? Maybe you could explain what you're basically looking at in Prewave.
Yeah. So this is, of course, one of the ways we help at Prewave, in that we provide this risk assessment and risk analysis based on a software solution. We have added country risk factors, sectoral risk factors. We are scoring commodities and products on the tier 1 level, on the tier N level. How are we doing that? On the country level, we are using NGO government data sets as provided from the ILO, as provided from the UN SDGs, as provided from, for instance, the Modern Slavery Index and others that we are using to score these topics. And we are also using a combined approach on scoring industry sectoral risks, commodity risks, again, based on available data sets, but also based on our own approach to scoring based on occurrence in media. So what's the likelihood we see in media data around occurrences, for instance, around accidents in the chemical industry versus the legal services industry. So these are things we can use to score sectors, products, commodities as well. Yeah.
And since I just found the question, are there going to be guidelines in the CS3D for sector or commodity risk? That's at least the information we have. So we have contacts to the EU legislator, and it is planned that there will be guidance on those sector and commodity risks, because indeed that's the more difficult part to find out where are the actual problems. You can find a lot of country ratings. That's pretty easy, but good data on which are the sectors that are problematic requires a lot of work, because you have to go through various data. If you're, let's say, not using Prewave, then you would need to go to very different databases to get the full picture on which sectors are problematic and which are not.
Another question I see coming up, Sebastian, and that could also be one for you to answer, is let's say under the CS3D now there's a lot more judgment calls also for the companies to make around scoping. I can scope this in, I can scope this out. How can they be held accountable? How can they ensure that what the decisions they are taking on scoping are actually valid? What are some maybe parameters they can use? Maybe before you answer, I will quickly say again, this could be a topic we touch in the next webinar. At Prewave, we are currently developing a scoping dashboard, which will provide already some guidelines and benchmarks of what to put in scope, that relates also to the size of your company, to the type of your, the nature of your business and the industry you are active in as a business. But yeah, maybe Sebastian, you can add to that.
I mean, that it is important, I think, to say that this requires work to do. So there is no easy way to basically say, okay, there is a certain scheme we can just use. So that's our scoping scheme. We found it on the internet. So it really requires that you look at your business sectors. So which kind of product are you producing? In which countries are you producing the products? Which countries are you sourcing from? How many suppliers are located in those countries? How big is your company? Are you a big player in the market? So that's so you need to define the market first, and all those questions you need to ask yourself and basically in the end, it could be something like a really huge table where you have all these information collected on basically your influence, your working streams, your sourcing streams of your company, and your effects on your surroundings, on society, as you could say, and this of course requires some time, and you need to take a closer look at the effects of your company. And of course, there might be some parts where you just don't have the answer because you also don't know, are there any risks connected with a certain product or a raw material? But then again, this would require you to take the time to find this out. And in the end, there are limits, right? And the lawmakers, they don't require the companies to know everything. And in the end, you just need to show, and that it's why it is so important to document everything. You just need to show that you used your best efforts and you did everything that was feasible and appropriate for your company to know about your risk areas and your non-risk areas.
One point that is raised that I think is interesting is that using the coffee example, don't I as a company then have also the possibility to just switch to another coffee supplier or coffee product where I have more confidence that there is a more, let's say, secure or clean supply chain? I think in the case, for instance, of the call center, relocating the call center to Germany, for instance, would maybe mitigate those likely risks, you know, on the working conditions. On the coffee, of course, that's harder. Is there some certification? Is there some transparency that the coffee trader gives you on where this coffee comes from? But I think that could definitely be an interesting way forward, that more and more transparency will also be provided by some of the retailers and traders so that you can, let's say, focus on buying materials and products where there's less risk for adverse impacts. Not sure what you think about. Yeah. There's a question about, I think that maybe you can clear up, Sebastian. What if the German Supply Chain Act and the CS3D are applying in parallel? Do I have to do both? Or is this actually not possible that it applies in parallel to a company?
No, it's basically not possible because the German Supply Chain Act already says that as soon as we have the CS3D ready, then so ready at the EU level, not transformed into national law, then the next step would be it needs to be transformed into national law. And this basically means that the German Supply Chain Act is adapted to the CS3D. So in the end, the German Supply Chain Act would change and would be in the end the law that transformed the CS3D into national law. So this cannot happen. So if you are falling under the German Supply Chain Act right now, it requires you to file a report to BAFA, and then in the end it has to be seen which authority is responsible under the CS3D, but it's quite likely that in the end it remains with BAFA. So that then you would basically need to file your report to BAFA, but your report that is basically addressing all the topics under the CS3D. And another important thing to mention is that the CSRD and the CS3D with respect to reporting obligations are already aligned. So the CSRD would be the one where you need to file the report. If you fall under both CSRD and CS3D, it doesn't require you to file another report under the CS3D. So it's basically just one report under the CSRD that needs to be filed, that is also addressing the topics of the CS3D. So the only thing that could happen is that for maybe 1 or 2 years, companies would need to file a report under the German Supply Chain Act and under the CSRD. So that's the only thing that could happen. But again, this is also something that may be still addressed in the process of the CS3D. So, but the double reporting obligations, it is not very likely that they take place at a huge scale.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Sebastian, I saw some questions around the potential waiving of reporting duties for the German Supply Chain Act, because the German Ministry of Economy said because of the CS3D, maybe you can speak to that.
There has been this newspaper interview of Robert Habeck, who basically said this, that he is of the opinion that it makes sense to waive the reporting obligations under the German Supply Chain Act. And then the explanation comes because he doesn't want double reporting obligations. But as I just said, right now, for basically most or all of the companies, there are no double reporting obligations. So the explanation, his explanation doesn't really fit to his conclusion. And there have been further questions to the German Ministry of Labor, who basically then said, okay, we just want to avoid double reporting obligations. So this sounded different than we just want to skip or waive the reporting obligations under the German Supply Chain Act. And that's basically it. Then we have a draft for a German law that basically wants to have less bureaucracy. And in this draft, there are several laws addressed and mentioned that shouldn't be implemented, or certain aspects should be left outside the scope. And the German Supply Chain Act is not mentioned in there. So the reporting obligations of the German Supply Chain Act is not mentioned in the act that wants to decrease bureaucracy. That's another something else that basically maybe they will add this in there, but for the moment we just have this interview, which is somehow strange because the result doesn't fit to the explanation. We don't have any further information, so our recommendation right now is that you just continue, because in the end, what would it even mean? If there is no reporting obligation, then still all the other due diligence obligations would need to be implemented. So the only difference is you wouldn't need to file a report. But the German authorities are already very active in asking questions. So then this would just lead to the situation that the BAFA would maybe ask all the questions that you would otherwise report just in certain letters, and ask the company, okay, what have you done with respect to this and that and that and that and that? And then you would need to answer something like a report to BAFA. So I think it doesn't really change anything, but it's good that you addressed it, that this question comes up, because of course this wasn't really helpful, this interview.
And there's also one question: what about companies that are currently affected by the German Supply Chain Act? Can they also go the way of simply working already under the CS3D approach and basically to some extent ignore the LKSG and just already work on CS3D and argue that towards BAFA? Or is it maybe a risky approach?
The thing is that the German authorities they also want to make their lives easy, right? And they want to compare certain companies with each other, and they just, let's say the reporting obligation remains, then they just have different reports and they put them next to each other and just compare them, and now if you have one report that is basically structured like the CS3D, it makes it more difficult for the German authorities to compare this. I'm not saying that it's wrong. If everything of the German Supply Chain Act is also included, then you couldn't say that the company didn't implement the German Act. But still, right now, we wouldn't recommend to do that. What you could do, and that is something that definitely makes sense if it's pretty clear that you will fall under the CS3D, to make transparent your risky supply chains. So if you know you are in a risky business sector or sourcing from high-risk countries, then you could already start to make transparent your deeper supply chain, because if no exception takes place, as the one we explained with directly linked and no leverage at all, no option to increase leverage, then it may become necessary under the CS3D that you make transparent that supply chain. And that's, of course, a lot of work, because that's a complex process. It's no easy way to make transparent an entire supply chain. It takes time. It takes effort, because you need to speak to different companies in the supply chain, and that's something you could already start with.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, maybe referring you again to our next webinar. We will also at Prewave have some other upcoming webinars with customers on topics like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the current import on Russian steel, the ban on Russian steel imports. So there's some upcoming webinars as well, but the next one with Sebastian will be on the 30th of November. We will, of course, send out the slides and also the recording to you afterwards. And with that, I want to thank Sebastian for again joining the webinar and for the great information shared. And I also want to thank everybody for participating and wish you a great day, and looking forward to see you in the next webinar.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.